The new student. The hallways of Lincoln High were bustling as students filed into their classrooms, the sound of lockers slamming and laughter echoing through the school's corridors. The bell rang sharply, signaling the beginning of first period. And in room 204, Miss Pamela Henson adjusted her glasses, brushing off an imaginary speck of dust from her pristine desk. Miss Henson had been an English teacher for over 20 years, known for her no-nonsense attitude and her stringent expectations. But beneath her strict professionalism, there were whispers among students and staff alike about her occasional biases, subtle but unmistakable. The students settled into their seats as Miss Henson started calling the roll. As she reached the last name, her voice faltered slightly. "Janelle Edwards," she said, her gaze shifting to the doorway. A girl with dark, curly hair entered the room, her head held high. Janelle was new to Lincoln High, having recently moved to the area with her father, who had taken a position as an administrator at the school. Her backpack slung over one shoulder, she scanned the room with steady eyes, showing neither hesitation nor fear. But as her eyes met Miss Henson's, a flash of tension passed between them. Miss Henson's smile was tight, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the new student. "Welcome to our English class, Janelle," Miss Henson said with an exaggerated formality. "I do hope you're prepared to meet our rigorous standards here at Lincoln. We cover complex material, and I trust you'll be able to keep up." Janelle nodded, her face calm. "Yes, Miss Henson," she replied softly, moving to an empty seat near the window. But the teacher's comment hadn't gone unnoticed. A few students exchanged glances, eyebrows raised at the sharpness in Miss Henson's tone. Unfazed, Janelle sat down and took out her notebook, her pen poised, ready to begin. "Today," Miss Henson announced, "we're discussing the theme of integrity in literature. We'll start with To Kill a Mockingbird, a classic examination of morality and social justice." She began her lesson, outlining the historical context of the novel and its themes. When she posed the first question to the class, a few students raised their hands hesitantly, while others slouched in their seats, clearly uninterested. But Janelle's hand was up immediately, her expression eager. Miss Henson scanned the room, her eyes flickering over Janelle before settling on a student at the back. "Yes, Alex," she said, choosing the boy who looked like he was about to doze off. As the lesson progressed, Janelle's hand continued to go up, but Miss Henson ignored her time and again, calling on other students, even when it was clear they were unprepared. Janelle's face showed no sign of frustration. She remained calm, taking notes, her eyes focused intently on Miss Henson. Finally, Miss Henson could no longer ignore her. Reluctantly, she nodded at Janelle. "Yes, Janelle, you seem to have something to add." Janelle nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I think Harper Lee uses the characters of Atticus and Scout to explore how society's prejudices influence both individual and community beliefs, creating conflicts that reflect the challenges in achieving true justice." Ms. Henson's lips pressed into a thin line. "An interesting perspective, Janelle," she said, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "But you might be oversimplifying the author's intentions. Lee's work is nuanced. Let's try to focus on the facts rather than personal interpretations." The room fell silent. Janelle's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she didn't respond. She simply nodded, as if to let it go. The first test. Over the next few days, it became increasingly clear that Ms. Henson had singled Janelle out. Whenever Janelle contributed to the discussion, Ms. Henson would find a way to twist her words, subtly undermining her insights or dismissing her altogether. Other students began to take notice. Some shot Janelle sympathetic glances, while others seemed to revel in the drama, whispering and snickering as Miss Henson's microaggressions became more obvious. One afternoon, Miss Henson announced an upcoming essay assignment. "I want each of you to analyze how the theme of justice is presented in To Kill a Mockingbird," she instructed, casting a quick glance in Janelle's direction. "And remember, this is a formal analysis. Personal biases and modern agendas have no place in academic writing. The implication was clear, and Janelle's cheeks flushed slightly. But she held her ground, jotting down the assignment requirements as the teacher continued. The following day, Janelle turned in her essay, her carefully crafted analysis of the novel, where she delved into the systemic injustices portrayed and how they reflect universal themes of discrimination. She knew she'd put her heart and mind into it, and she felt proud. When Ms. Henson handed back the papers, Janelle's heart sank. Her paper was covered in red ink, marked with sharp critiques, and at the bottom, a barely passing grade. Beneath the grade, Ms. Henson had written, "Your arguments lack depth and fail to align with academic standards. I expected more." For the first time, Janelle felt her calm facade cracking. She sat at her desk, staring at the paper, feeling the sting of humiliation and disappointment. She knew her work was solid, that she had poured hours of research and thought into the analysis. But Ms. Henson's harsh feedback felt like a slap in the face. Taking a deep breath, Janelle raised her hand. When Ms. Henson finally acknowledged her, she asked in a steady voice, "Could you clarify which parts of my analysis didn't meet academic standards?" Ms. Henson's eyes flashed with annoyance. "As I mentioned in my notes, Janelle, you seem more focused on imposing a modern viewpoint onto the text, rather than objectively analyzing the author's intent. Perhaps you should consider revising your approach if you hope to succeed in this class." Janelle nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had expected a challenging curriculum at Lincoln, but not like this. The silent glances from her classmates only fueled her determination to prove herself. The teacher's growing discomfort. As the weeks went on, Janelle continued to work diligently, turning in assignments and participating in discussions. Yet each time she raised her hand, Ms. Henson's dismissal grew colder. Some students began to mutter under their breaths, sensing the unfairness, while others avoided making eye contact, hoping to steer clear of Ms. Henson's line of fire. Meanwhile, Janelle's father, Mr. Edwards, had quietly observed his daughter's growing frustration each evening. As Lincoln High's principal, he took pride in the school's reputation for inclusivity and academic rigor, and he'd worked hard to maintain those standards. But he could see that Janelle's experience was far from what he had envisioned. After overhearing a comment about Ms. Henson's dismissive behavior from one of Janelle's classmates, Mr. Edwards began to wonder if there was more at play than simple academic expectations. He kept his role as her father discreet, not wanting to influence her experience. But as he saw her spirits slowly being chipped away, he couldn't remain silent. One day after school, he approached Ms. Henson's classroom, knocking gently on the door. Ms. Henson looked up from her desk, clearly caught off guard to see the principal standing there. "Mr. Edwards," she greeted with a strained smile. "What brings you to my class?" "I thought I'd check in, Miss Henson," he replied, his gaze steady. "It's come to my attention that there might be some issues in your classroom, specifically with regard to classroom participation and grading practices." Ms. Henson's face tightened slightly, though she kept her tone polite. "I assure you, Mr. Edwards, I maintain strict standards in my classroom, as I do with every student. Academic rigor requires that I hold each student accountable to the same expectations." Mr. Edwards nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Of course, Miss Henson, I just want to ensure that all our students feel supported and valued. Lincoln High prides itself on providing a respectful learning environment." The two held each other's gaze, an unspoken challenge hanging between them. Ms. Henson nodded slowly, masking her discomfort. "Understood, Mr. Edwards. I assure you, my intentions are to nurture excellence in each student." But as Mr. Edwards turned to leave, Ms. Henson's eyes hardened, a flicker of resentment simmering beneath her carefully composed smile. Little did she realize that her behavior was being closely watched, not only by her students but also by the one person who held the power to bring her prejudice into the light. And as Janelle walked into her next class with renewed resolve, a spark of determination in her eyes, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the walls of Lincoln High to their very core. The struggle intensifies. The days following Mr. Edwards' subtle check-in with Miss Henson were strained. Janelle could feel an invisible wall between her and the teacher that seemed to grow stronger with each passing class. Every time she raised her hand or tried to speak, Miss Henson found ways to undermine her efforts. If Janelle offered an answer, Miss Henson would pick it apart, with scrutiny reserved only for her. If she contributed to a group discussion, Miss Henson would sigh or shake her head in disapproval. It was one thing for Janelle to be ignored, but Miss Henson had escalated to a quiet form of warfare, aiming to exhaust her with subtle humiliations that were almost too small to notice but cut just as deeply. Janelle's classmates noticed too, and while some shared looks of sympathy, others seemed to relish the tension, waiting to see if Janelle would snap. One Friday afternoon, Miss Henson announced a pop quiz on their assigned reading of To Kill a Mockingbird. The quiz contained questions that demanded careful thought, and Janelle, despite the mounting stress, felt confident in her responses. As the quiz ended, Miss Henson collected the papers, giving Janelle a thin, unreadable smile as she took hers. The look sent a chill down Janelle's spine. On Monday, the graded quizzes were handed back. Janelle glanced at her paper and felt her heart sink. She had received a barely passing grade, and the paper was marked with numerous red comments, some that seemed petty, nitpicking at details that had little to do with the quality of her answers. Janelle clenched her jaw, her frustration boiling inside. She knew the material. She knew her answers had been more than adequate. But here it was in stark red ink, a calculated attack on her confidence. When the bell rang to dismiss the class, Janelle gathered her things slowly, waiting for the other students to leave. She approached Ms. Henson's desk, holding her quiz tightly in her hands. "Ms. Henson," she began carefully, "I'd like to discuss my quiz grade. I think I may have missed some points that could clarify my answers." Ms. Henson looked up, feigning surprise. "Is there something wrong with your grade, Janelle?" "Yes," Janelle replied, her voice steady but restrained. "I think I answered the questions thoughtfully. I'd like to understand where I went wrong." Miss Henson raised her eyebrows, a smug expression flickering across her face. "Oh, Janelle, sometimes it's not about what you write, but how well you understand the deeper meaning of the text. Your answers were, well, shallow." Janelle's cheeks burned. "I don't understand. Could you point out where my answers didn't meet your expectations?" Miss Henson's lips curved into a tight smile. "If you truly understood the text, you wouldn't need me to explain it. Perhaps a bit more focus on the classics and a little less on modern ideas might help you in the future." The words were laced with implication, and Janelle understood exactly what Miss Henson meant. Taking a deep breath, she held her composure, nodding slowly. "Thank you for the feedback, Miss Henson," she said, her voice steady. Miss Henson's gaze lingered on her, almost as if daring her to react, but Janelle refused to give her that satisfaction. She turned and walked out of the classroom, her heart pounding and anger burning in her chest. A talk with Mr. Edwards. That evening at the dinner table, Mr. Edwards noticed his daughter's distant expression. He had seen the change in her demeanor over the past few weeks, but had wanted to give her space, hoping she would open up on her own. But tonight, her silence was palpable, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. "Janelle, honey, how's school going?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Janelle hesitated, staring down at her plate. Finally, she sighed, looking up at her father. "Dad, do you think some teachers can judge students unfairly?" Mr. Edwards' eyes narrowed slightly. "Why do you ask?" Janelle fiddled with her fork, gathering her thoughts. "Miss Henson, my English teacher, she's different with me. I can feel it. No matter what I do, it's like she already has this opinion of me." Mr. Edwards' expression softened with understanding. "What has she done specifically, Janelle?" She recounted the incidents, the ignored raised hands, the excessive red marks on her paper, the pointed comments. As she spoke, Mr. Edwards felt a surge of anger. But he maintained his composure, not wanting to alarm his daughter. "I knew starting at a new school would be challenging," Janelle said softly. But it feels like she's targeting me for reasons that have nothing to do with my work. Mr. Edwards leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand over hers. Janelle, remember that your voice and your ideas are important, regardless of what anyone else thinks. It's possible Miss Henson is holding you to a higher standard than she does with others, but that says more about her than it does about you. You keep doing your best, and know that I'll support you in any way I can. Janelle nodded, comforted by her father's words, but still carrying the weight of her struggles. She knew he was the principal, but she wanted to face this challenge on her own terms. She didn't want to be known as the principal's daughter who ran to her father for help, but knowing he believed in her gave her the strength to keep going. The group project. 2 weeks later, Ms. Henson announced a group project, assigning students to work on presentations exploring themes in To Kill a Mockingbird. Each group was to choose a theme, analyze it, and present their findings. Ms. Henson assigned the groups herself, pairing Janelle with 2 classmates, Allison and Craig, who were known for their academic excellence. When the groups gathered to discuss their project, Janelle suggested focusing on racial injustice, a core theme of the novel. But Allison and Craig seemed hesitant. "Are you sure we should go with that theme?" Allison asked, casting a wary glance in the direction of Miss Henson, who was overseeing the groups from her desk. "It's a little controversial." Craig nodded. "Yeah, Miss Henson might not appreciate it. Maybe we should go with something safer, like moral courage." Janelle's heart sank, understanding their hesitation, but she wasn't willing to back down. "I know it might be challenging, but racial injustice is a central theme in the book. I think it's important to address it, even if it's uncomfortable." Allison bit her lip, glancing at Craig. Maybe she has a point. The book does focus on those issues, and it's not like we'd be bringing in anything outside of what's in the text. Reluctantly, Craig nodded. "All right, let's go for it. But let's be careful how we word things. We don't want to get on Miss Henson's bad side." Janelle nodded, relieved but still cautious. They spent the next week preparing their presentation, carefully structuring their analysis to highlight how the book's depiction of racial injustice resonated with universal themes of morality and social responsibility. Janelle took the lead, crafting thoughtful arguments and gathering textual evidence to support their points. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, determined to show Miss Henson and the class that her voice deserved to be heard. Presentation Day. On the day of the presentation, Janelle's group stood at the front of the room, their project board propped up behind them. Miss Henson sat at her desk, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed as she watched them with an air of skepticism. Allison began, summarizing the general themes of the novel before Craig took over, discussing the character's development. Finally, it was Janelle's turn. She stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "As we've discussed, To Kill a Mockingbird explores themes of moral courage and justice," Janelle began. "But it also shows how deeply ingrained prejudices can distort our sense of right and wrong, affecting both individuals and communities." She went on to analyze how the book depicted racial injustice, drawing connections to the struggles faced by the characters and how those struggles reflected broader societal issues. She referenced specific passages, her voice clear and confident. As she spoke, a hush fell over the room, and for the first time, her classmates seemed genuinely engaged, nodding along with her points. But as she finished, Miss Henson's lips tightened, her expression growing darker. "Thank you, Janelle," Miss Henson said, her tone icy. "An ambitious presentation, though perhaps a bit narrow in perspective. Literature should inspire critical thought, not merely reflect modern agendas. We study these classics to gain insight into universal themes, not to project current issues onto them." The subtle dig hung in the air, and Janelle felt her face flush. She had expected criticism, but not such open dismissal. She looked at her classmates, some of whom shot her sympathetic glances, others glancing nervously at Miss Henson. Janelle took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "With all due respect, Miss Henson, the issues in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant now as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away. A tense silence followed her words, and Miss Henson's face hardened. For a moment, Janelle wondered if she had gone too far, if she had overstepped. But she knew she couldn't back down now. "Well, Janelle," Miss Henson replied, her tone dripping with condescension, "perhaps you should consider how much of yourself you're projecting onto the text. Let's not confuse personal feelings with academic analysis." Janelle nodded, forcing herself to remain calm. But inside, she felt a storm brewing, a quiet resolve to prove Miss Henson wrong. She had reached her breaking point, and she knew this was far from over. Little did Miss Henson realize that her dismissive response was about to set off a chain of events that would expose the prejudice lurking beneath her carefully constructed facade. And Janelle, with the unyielding support of her father and her own unbreakable spirit, was ready to face whatever came next. Quiet rebellion. The tension between Miss Henson and Janelle only intensified after the group presentation. Janelle had stood her ground, but Miss Henson had made it clear that she saw her as nothing more than an idealistic, opinionated student who needed to be corrected. To Janelle, it felt like no matter how much she worked or how thoroughly she prepared, Miss Henson would find a way to undermine her efforts. As days turned into weeks, Miss Henson's behavior grew more openly antagonistic. She assigned Janelle an independent essay on an obscure topic, far removed from the class syllabus, claiming it would broaden her understanding of classical literature. It was a veiled punishment, meant to occupy her time and wear her down. Janelle poured hours into researching the topic, combing through dusty old books in the school library, while her classmates worked on simpler, more relevant assignments. Meanwhile, whispers started spreading through the school. Some students felt sympathy for Janelle, admiring her resilience, but others thought she should just play along with Miss Henson to make her life easier. The cafeteria, the hallways, and even the basketball court were filled with murmurs about the quiet, building tension between the teacher and her favorite student. Despite the pressure, Janelle refused to back down. She completed the additional assignments, she aced quizzes, and she raised her hand in class, even when she knew Miss Henson would likely ignore her. Her defiance was subtle, a quiet rebellion against Miss Henson's authority. And while she didn't seek confrontation, she was no longer afraid to speak up when she felt she was being treated unfairly. But Miss Henson was becoming bolder too. An unwelcome visit. One afternoon, as the final bell rang and students filtered out of their classrooms, Miss Henson stopped Janelle in the hallway. "Ms. Edwards," she said, her voice dripping with exaggerated politeness. "A word, if you don't mind." Janelle paused, glancing around. A few students lingered nearby, pretending to check their phones but clearly curious about the interaction. "Yes, Miss Henson," Janelle replied, her voice steady. "I'm concerned about your focus in my class," Miss Henson said, her smile tight. "You seem more interested in debating me than actually learning. That attitude won't help you succeed here at Lincoln, or anywhere else." Janelle blinked, surprised at the teacher's frankness. "I'm just trying to understand the material, Miss Henson," she replied carefully. "I don't mean to come off as disrespectful." Miss Henson's expression hardened. "Well, Ms. Edwards, I suggest you learn to respect authority. Not every classroom will tolerate your individualistic approach. We value structure here." Janelle felt a surge of frustration, but instead of backing down, she met Ms. Henson's gaze. "Respect goes both ways, Ms. Henson." The teacher's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, another voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" Janelle turned, startled to see her father standing a few feet away. Mr. Edwards, always dignified and composed, looked from Miss Henson to his daughter, his gaze cool and assessing. Miss Henson's expression faltered, her confident demeanor slipping just slightly. "No problem at all, Mr. Edwards," Miss Henson replied, her voice honeyed. "Just a little advice for Janelle here. She seems to have some misunderstandings about our expectations in class. Mr. Edwards smiled, but there was a subtle edge to it. "I trust my daughter's understanding of academic expectations is strong, Miss Henson. She's a diligent student. I'm sure whatever challenges she faces in your class will only help her grow." Miss Henson forced a tight smile, but her eyes flashed with irritation. "Of course, Mr. Edwards, it's my duty to challenge all my students." As Janelle and her father walked away, she glanced up at him, a mixture of gratitude and frustration in her expression. "Dad, you didn't have to step in." He sighed, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I didn't want to, Janelle. But I won't stand by and let anyone treat you unfairly. You're strong, but that doesn't mean you have to carry this burden alone." Janelle nodded, appreciating his support even as she felt a renewed sense of determination. Miss Henson's behavior had crossed a line, and now it was clear that her father, too, had his eye on the situation. She knew that this confrontation wasn't over, and it would only be a matter of time before things came to a head. The parent-teacher conference. As if sensing Mr. Edwards' presence as a looming threat, Ms. Henson escalated her attacks. She started grading Janelle's work even more harshly, scrutinizing every minor detail and marking her down for the slightest deviations from her preferred format. Even though Janelle continued to perform well, Ms. Henson's grades told a different story. Then came the letter home, a request for a parent-teacher conference. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Janelle was apprehensive as she and her father entered the small, impersonal meeting room, where Ms. Henson sat with a neat stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as they entered, her expression coldly professional. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Edwards, Janelle." She greeted them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought it would be beneficial to discuss Janelle's progress in my class." Mr. Edwards nodded politely, his face unreadable. "Of course. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Miss Henson." Ms. Henson launched into a rehearsed speech about academic standards and the need for objective analysis in her class, peppering her words with thinly veiled criticisms of Janelle's performance. She pulled out her graded assignments, pointing to various marks and corrections she'd made, most of which seemed unnecessarily harsh or nitpicky. "Janelle shows promise," Ms. Henson concluded, but her focus on modern interpretations, shall we say, sometimes distracts her from the curriculum. "I want to ensure she's able to meet Lincoln's high standards." Mr. Edwards listened patiently, nodding in the right places. When Ms. Henson finished, he leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but sharp. "Ms. Henson," he began, his voice steady, "I appreciate your commitment to maintaining high standards. But I'd like to address the inconsistencies in Janelle's grades. I've reviewed her work myself, and I can't help but notice a pattern that's difficult to ignore." Ms. Henson's smile tightened. "I assure you, Mr. Edwards, I grade all my students according to the same rubric." "That may be," Mr. Edwards replied, "but Janelle's work shows a level of thoughtfulness that should be recognized, not discouraged. I wonder if perhaps the grading criteria might be slightly subjective in her case." A tense silence filled the room. Ms. Henson's face flushed, but she quickly recovered, her voice carefully measured. "I assure you, Mr. Edwards, I remain entirely objective in my assessments." Mr. Edwards gave a slow nod, his gaze steady. "Very well, Ms. Henson. I'll be taking a closer look at Janelle's academic experience. I'm confident that she's more than capable of meeting and exceeding the standards here." With that, the conference ended on a note of unresolved tension. As Janelle and her father walked out, she felt a strange sense of relief. Her father's subtle but firm stance had left Ms. Henson visibly unsettled, but she also knew it had likely deepened the teacher's resentment. The breaking point. In the days following the conference, Ms. Henson's treatment of Janelle became overtly hostile. She interrupted her answers in class, humiliated her over minor mistakes, and assigned her the most difficult tasks in group projects. But Janelle endured, her quiet defiance growing stronger with each passing day. One morning, as Janelle entered the classroom, she noticed that Ms. Henson had written a new assignment on the board, a critical analysis essay on To Kill a Mockingbird. The assignment required a detailed exploration of the book's themes, and Ms. Henson emphasized that the essays would be graded rigorously. Janelle was determined to excel. She spent hours in the library, poring over analyses, pulling quotes from reputable sources, and crafting an essay that she knew was her best work yet. She cited every claim meticulously, leaving no room for Ms. Henson to pick apart her arguments. On the day she submitted the essay, Janelle felt a sense of triumph. She knew her work was solid, and she hoped, just this once, that Ms. Henson would have no choice but to acknowledge her effort. A week later, when Ms. Henson handed back the graded essays, Janelle's heart raced. She scanned the paper, searching for her grade, and felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over her. She had received a failing grade. At the top of the paper, in bold red letters, Ms. Henson had written, "Unoriginal analysis. Shows a lack of understanding of the text's deeper themes." Janelle sat frozen, staring at the harsh words, feeling a mixture of shock and anger. She had worked harder on this essay than anything she'd ever written, and Ms. Henson's response felt like a punch to the gut. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but Janelle remained in her seat, her hands shaking. Ms. Henson glanced in her direction, an almost satisfied look on her face. Unable to stay silent, Janelle stood up, clutching her essay. "Ms. Henson," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger, "I worked hard on this paper. I cited my sources. I followed your instructions. Why did you give me a failing grade?" Ms. Henson's eyes gleamed with a subtle, cold satisfaction. "As I mentioned, Janelle, your analysis lacked originality. Perhaps you should consider reading the text more closely." Janelle's hands clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I did read it closely. I put everything I had into this assignment. I don't understand why you think my work isn't good enough." Ms. Henson's smile widened, cold and unyielding. "Well, Janelle, perhaps that's because you're not quite suited for this level of analysis." The words hung in the air, and Janelle felt a surge of defiance. She knew at that moment that Ms. Henson's prejudice ran deeper than she'd realized, and that nothing she did would ever be enough to satisfy her. But she was done being silent. Holding her head high, she replied, "Thank you, Ms. Henson. I'll keep that in mind." As Janelle walked out of the classroom, her mind was made up. She wouldn't let Ms. Henson's words define her, and she wouldn't let the teacher's prejudice silence her. She would speak to her father that evening, ready to bring this battle out of the shadows and into the light. The storm brewing beneath the surface was about to explode, and Janelle was prepared to face it head-on. The principal's stand. That evening, Janelle's father, Mr. Edwards, sat at the kitchen table with her, his brow furrowed as she shared the latest developments. She showed him her graded essay, pointing to Ms. Henson's harsh, dismissive comments and explaining how she had followed every instruction, only to be given a failing grade. Mr. Edwards listened intently, his face a mix of anger and sadness. As an administrator, he had encountered complaints about teachers before, but hearing the story directly from his own daughter made it feel all too personal. He could see the hurt in Janelle's eyes, the frustration she bottled up in her determination to handle things on her own. He admired her resilience, but knew it was time to step in. "This can't continue, Janelle," he said, placing a comforting hand over hers. "You're being subjected to unfair treatment, and it's my responsibility as both your father and the principal to address this." Janelle hesitated, searching his face. "Dad, I didn't want to involve you. I thought I could handle it. But—" Mr. Edwards nodded. "I understand, honey, and I'm proud of how you've handled yourself. But this is beyond personal now. Ms. Henson's actions are affecting your education, and that's unacceptable. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about ensuring that no student has to go through this." Janelle felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had reached her breaking point, and knowing that her father would stand by her gave her the courage to face whatever came next. The following morning, Mr. Edwards scheduled a formal meeting with Miss Henson, including an assistant principal and a representative from the district's HR department. He wanted this conversation to be documented, and he was determined to address Ms. Henson's behavior head-on. The confrontation. Ms. Henson entered the meeting room, her expression guarded. She glanced around the table, taking in Mr. Edwards, the assistant principal, and the HR representative with a hint of apprehension. But she quickly composed herself, flashing a polite smile. "Thank you all for meeting with me this morning," Mr. Edwards began, his tone calm but firm. "I called this meeting to discuss a series of complaints regarding classroom conduct. Specifically, concerns have been raised about the treatment of certain students, including my daughter, Janelle." Ms. Henson's face barely twitched, though her grip on her folder tightened. "I assure you, Mr. Edwards, I hold all my students to the same standards. If Janelle or anyone else feels that my expectations are too high, I would encourage them to work harder rather than overreact." The HR representative leaned forward, her voice neutral but firm. "Ms. Henson, we're here because we've received reports that your grading practices and classroom interactions may be influenced by personal biases. We take these concerns seriously." Ms. Henson's eyes flicked toward Mr. Edwards, a flash of resentment in her gaze. "I would expect the principal to support his teachers rather than undermining them based on isolated complaints." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, maintaining his composure. "My role, Ms. Henson, is to support our students' right to a fair and equitable education. When any teacher's conduct appears to compromise that right, it's my duty to address it. I've reviewed Janelle's work myself, and I found her responses to be thoughtful and well-supported. Yet, she's consistently received lower grades and harsher feedback than her peers. I'd like to understand why." Ms. Henson's face grew flushed, but she forced a thin smile. "Perhaps Janelle's performance simply hasn't met the standards I expect. I treat her no differently than any other student." Mr. Edwards's voice hardened. "Really? Then explain the personal comments, the dismissive feedback, and the out-of-syllabus assignments specifically given to Janelle. This isn't about academic standards. It's about targeting a student." The HR representative nodded, glancing at Ms. Henson with a serious expression. "We'll be conducting a review of your grading practices and classroom observations, Ms. Henson. This includes interviews with students to get a full picture of the classroom environment." Ms. Henson's face reddened further, but she nodded stiffly. "Of course. I have nothing to hide." Mr. Edwards felt a sense of relief, but he also knew that Ms. Henson's resentment would only grow. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. Janelle's voice. The investigation brought a strange sense of hope to Janelle, but it also stirred whispers among her classmates. Students noticed that the HR representative occasionally visited their classroom, sitting quietly in the back and taking notes. Some students, emboldened by the chance to speak up, shared their observations, recounting Ms. Henson's favoritism, her dismissive tone with certain students, and the obvious difference in how she treated Janelle. But Ms. Henson remained defiant, doubling down on her grading practices and only giving Janelle the barest minimum of attention. However, for every cutting remark or unfair grade, Janelle found herself increasingly supported by her classmates. One afternoon, during a small group discussion, a student named Sarah, a quiet girl who rarely spoke out, leaned over to Janelle. "You know," Sarah whispered, glancing around to make sure Ms. Henson wasn't listening, "we all see how she treats you. It's not fair. I'm sorry you have to go through this." Janelle felt a surge of gratitude, surprised by the support. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot." Sarah nodded. "I don't think Ms. Henson realizes that everyone sees what she's doing. You're braver than most of us would be." Other students gradually began to show their support, subtly at first, a nod here, a quiet word of encouragement there. But over time, Janelle realized that she wasn't as alone as she had once felt. Then came the turning point. The class assignment. One Friday, Ms. Henson assigned the class an individual project. An analysis of social issues in literature. Students were allowed to pick any novel, and Janelle chose To Kill a Mockingbird. The topic was perfect, and she was determined to give it everything she had. Over the weekend, Janelle dove into the project, carefully analyzing passages and incorporating insights from literary critics. She cited historical references and examined how the themes in the novel echoed issues in modern society. By Sunday night, she had written what she felt was her best work yet, a polished and passionate exploration of justice and morality. On Monday, she submitted her paper, feeling a mixture of pride and anxiety. She knew Miss Henson would be grading it, but she also knew it was an exceptional piece of work. And with the HR investigation ongoing, Miss Henson might be less inclined to unfairly criticize her. But when the papers were returned on Wednesday, Janelle's heart sank. She scanned the page, her eyes locking on the grade at the top, another low mark, along with a comment that read, "This analysis lacks originality and demonstrates a superficial understanding of the text." Janelle felt a knot of anger tighten in her chest. She knew the work was good. She had poured her heart into it. And yet Miss Henson continued to dismiss her effort as if she were incapable of deeper thought. A quiet fury simmered in Janelle as she sat at her desk, staring at the paper. She knew she couldn't let this go. Standing up. After class, Janelle approached Miss Henson's desk, her face composed, but her voice firm. "Miss Henson, I'd like to understand your feedback on my paper," Janelle said, holding up the essay. Miss Henson looked up, her face a mask of disinterest. "There's nothing more to explain, Janelle. Your work didn't meet the required standard." Janelle held her ground. "Could you point out specific examples of where my analysis was lacking?" Ms. Henson's gaze hardened. "As I've already noted, your focus on modern perspectives clouds your analysis. Perhaps if you took a more traditional approach, your work would reflect a deeper understanding." Janelle felt the simmering anger boil over. "Ms. Henson, I followed the assignment guidelines. I provided textual evidence, cited credible sources, and analyzed the themes in a way that reflects the book's relevance. I deserve a fair assessment." Ms. Henson's face flushed with irritation. "If you're unable to handle constructive criticism, Janelle, perhaps you're not suited for advanced analysis." Janelle took a deep breath, steadying herself. She was done with being pushed around. "I'm more than capable of handling constructive criticism, Ms. Henson. What I'm asking for is a fair evaluation of my work. And if you're unable to provide that, maybe it's time someone else does." Ms. Henson's face twisted, her composure slipping for just a moment. "Enough, Janelle. You're crossing a line." But Janelle held her ground, refusing to back down. "Maybe I am, but someone has to." The entire class had grown silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Ms. Henson looked around, noticing the attentive gazes of her students, the surprise and curiosity in their expressions. For the first time, it dawned on her that she was not as untouchable as she had assumed. "I'll be speaking to my father about this," Janelle said quietly, her voice calm but determined. "And I'll request a revaluation of this assignment." Ms. Henson's mouth opened, but no words came out. She simply stared at Janelle, her face flushed with anger and shock. As Janelle turned to leave the classroom, a few students murmured words of encouragement, while others exchanged glances, impressed by her courage. She walked out with her head held high, feeling a surge of pride and relief. She had finally stood up, refusing to let Ms. Henson's prejudice silence her voice. In that moment, Janelle knew that whatever came next, she had the strength to face it, and the support of her classmates and her father to back her up. As the door closed behind her, Miss Henson realized that her power in the classroom was slipping, her carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble. And in the days that followed, it would be Janelle's courage that would spark a transformation, exposing years of prejudice and setting the stage for change at Lincoln High. Ripple effects. The following day, the tension was palpable in Miss Henson's English classroom. Every student had heard about the confrontation between Janelle and Miss Henson, and while some students tried to act casual, their stolen glances and whispers spoke volumes. Janelle sat at her desk with a quiet confidence, the weight of the previous day's events still fresh, but her resolve stronger than ever. The assistant principal, Ms. Ramirez, entered the room just as the bell rang. The students fell silent, their attention drawn to the unexpected visitor. She addressed the class with a warm smile, but there was a formality to her tone. "Good morning, class. Today I'll be sitting in to observe. Just continue as usual." Ms. Henson's face was impassive, but her tight posture and pursed lips betrayed her unease. This was the first formal observation since the complaints had surfaced, and she knew she was under scrutiny. Despite her discomfort, she carried on with the day's lesson, her voice steady, but her usual sharpness dulled by the presence of an administrator. Ms. Ramirez watched carefully as the lesson unfolded. When Ms. Henson called on students, her manner was unusually restrained, devoid of her usual patronizing remarks. The students exchanged glances, sensing the change in atmosphere, and even those who often kept to themselves began to feel emboldened, raising their hands more frequently and speaking with confidence. Janelle remained calm, her hand raised several times throughout the lesson, and while Ms. Henson seemed reluctant, she eventually called on her. For once, Janelle's answer wasn't interrupted or dismissed. Ms. Ramirez's presence seemed to temper Ms. Henson's usual behavior, but Janelle knew this was just a temporary reprieve. When class ended, Ms. Ramirez stayed behind, pulling Ms. Henson aside for a private discussion. The students filed out, some lingering in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse or overhear some part of the conversation. Although they couldn't hear anything, the serious expressions on Ms. Ramirez's and Ms. Henson's faces were enough to fuel the rumor mill. A call for change. Later that day, Janelle went to see her father, Mr. Edwards, in his office. She knocked gently, and he looked up from his desk, offering her a warm smile. "Come in, Janelle. How was class today?" Janelle took a seat across from him, her expression thoughtful. Ms. Ramirez was observing the class. Ms. Henson was different. She didn't treat anyone poorly, not even me. It's like she was putting on a show. Mr. Edwards nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. It's not unusual for people to act differently under observation, but that doesn't mean we should let our guard down. This isn't just about one day of good behavior. Janelle's gaze was steady. "I know, Dad, but I'm tired of feeling like I'm fighting alone. I want to make sure this doesn't just stop with me." Her father leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking the same thing. This isn't just about you. It's about every student who might be dealing with similar treatment. If you're ready, I'd like us to take this further, not just for you, but for the school as a whole." Janelle nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't want Ms. Henson's behavior to remain hidden behind a facade of professional conduct. Together, she and her father brainstormed a plan to bring awareness to the issue and promote a positive shift in the school's culture. An unexpected ally. That afternoon, Janelle met up with a few friends at lunch. The cafeteria buzzed with activity, and several students stopped to offer her words of encouragement. Even those who hadn't paid much attention to her before now approached her with words of support. Among them was Ethan, a quiet, thoughtful student known for his academic excellence, but who rarely spoke out. "Hey, Janelle," Ethan said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I heard about what happened with Ms. Henson. I just wanted to say, you're brave. Not everyone would stand up like you did." Janelle smiled, grateful for his words. "Thanks, Ethan. It wasn't easy, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore." Ethan nodded. "If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. Honestly, Ms. Henson's treatment of you has been obvious to a lot of us. Some of us have seen her do similar things to other students too. It's like she chooses who she respects." Ethan's words sparked an idea in Janelle's mind. "Actually, there is something you could help with. If we can gather more students willing to share their experiences, it might add weight to the investigation." Ethan agreed, and over the next week, Janelle and her friends discreetly spoke to other students, encouraging them to share their stories with the administration. They kept their conversations low-key, meeting in study halls or after school, creating a small network of students who felt similarly about Ms. Henson's conduct. To their surprise, more students than they expected came forward with stories, each recounting moments of unfairness, dismissiveness, or subtle, belittling remarks. As more students joined in, Janelle felt a powerful sense of solidarity. What had started as a personal battle was transforming into a school-wide movement for accountability. Ms. Henson's facade cracks. In the following weeks, Ms. Henson's once ironclad reputation began to show signs of wear. The HR investigation had expanded to include interviews with students and parents, and Ms. Ramirez conducted random classroom visits to observe her teaching. The subtle scrutiny took its toll on Ms. Henson, who grew visibly tense, her previously confident demeanor fraying at the edges. One day, as Ms. Henson was lecturing on To Kill a Mockingbird, Janelle noticed her teacher's usual composed facade slip. Ms. Henson's voice wavered as she discussed the novel's themes, her eyes darting toward the back of the room where Ms. Ramirez sat, observing her every move. Janelle's classmates sensed the shift too, and for the first time, Ms. Henson seemed almost vulnerable. But rather than feeling triumphant, Janelle felt a pang of sadness. Despite everything, she had once respected Ms. Henson, admired her as a teacher. It was painful to see the reality of her prejudice laid bare. Toward the end of class, Ms. Henson assigned a short essay. "You'll have the rest of the class period to work on it," she announced, her voice strained. Janelle began working, but her mind was distracted by the tension in the room. The other students exchanged glances, and a few murmured among themselves, noticing Ms. Henson's uncharacteristic silence. As the bell rang, Ms. Henson called Janelle to her desk, a forced smile on her face. "Janelle, I wanted to discuss your recent paper." Janelle approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "I see you've made an effort," Ms. Henson said, her tone lacking its usual edge. "But you still need to focus more on the traditional analysis rather than other perspectives." Janelle met her gaze, her voice calm but resolute. "Ms. Henson, I stand by my work. It's relevant, and it's what I believe reflects the novel's themes." Ms. Henson's expression hardened momentarily before she nodded. "Very well, Janelle. I trust you'll consider my feedback." As Janelle turned to leave, she felt a sense of finality. This battle with Ms. Henson was nearing its end, and she was ready to see it through, no matter the outcome. The town hall meeting. Word of Ms. Henson's behavior and the student-led movement had spread throughout the school community. Mr. Edwards, recognizing the importance of transparency, arranged a town hall meeting for parents, students, and faculty to address the growing concerns. On the evening of the meeting, the school's auditorium was packed. Janelle sat near the front, her heart pounding as she looked around the room. She recognized several students who had shared their stories, as well as parents and teachers who had come to show their support. Mr. Edwards took the stage, his calm demeanor projecting authority. He opened the meeting by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised and inviting students to speak. One by one, Janelle's classmates stood up, sharing their experiences with Ms. Henson. Each story was different, but the common theme was clear. Ms. Henson's behavior had affected countless students, undermining their confidence and their love for learning. Finally, Janelle stood up, her voice steady but full of emotion. "For a long time, I tried to handle Ms. Henson's treatment on my own. I thought if I just worked harder, I could change her opinion. But I realized it wasn't about my work, it was about who I am. And no student should ever feel like they're not good enough because of who they are." Her words resonated, and the room fell silent. Parents and students alike nodded, moved by her courage. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Edwards assured everyone that the school would take steps to ensure a fair and supportive environment for all students. He promised that no student would have to endure the kind of treatment Janelle had faced. The aftermath. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, Ms. Henson's role at the school was reassessed. She was placed on administrative leave, pending further review of her conduct and grading practices. The administration implemented new policies for classroom evaluations and created a platform where students could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. While Ms. Henson's fate remained uncertain, the school's atmosphere began to shift. Students felt a renewed sense of empowerment, knowing their voices mattered. Teachers, too, reflected on their own practices, reminded of the importance of treating each student with respect and dignity. As for Janelle, she felt a profound sense of relief and pride. She had faced down prejudice, not only for herself, but for everyone who had felt silenced or dismissed. Her classmates now looked up to her, seeing her not just as a fellow student, but as a leader. One day, as she was leaving school, Ethan caught up to her. "Janelle," he said, a smile on his face, "you did something amazing. You changed things for all of us." Janelle smiled, feeling the weight of his words. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. As she walked home, Janelle felt lighter, free of the burden she had carried for so long. She knew she had made a difference, and that knowledge gave her the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. A new beginning. The weeks following the town hall meeting brought a noticeable transformation to Lincoln High. The student body was more connected, a quiet revolution spreading through the hallways, classrooms, and even the faculty lounge. Teachers who had once been complacent took note, reevaluating their own teaching styles and how they approached their students. And students, inspired by Janelle's courage, felt empowered to speak up for themselves and others, challenging any remnants of unfairness or bias in their learning environment. Janelle herself was adjusting to a new reality. The weight she'd carried was gone, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and relief. But the journey was far from over, and she knew there was still work to be done to make Lincoln High a place where every student felt valued and respected. Ms. Henson's return. A month after the town hall, the administration sent a school-wide email announcing that Ms. Henson would be returning to the classroom under strict observation and with a commitment to engage in diversity training. The news spread quickly, sparking mixed reactions. Some students were shocked, while others felt uneasy. But a quiet sense of hope lingered, especially among those who believed that people, even those as hardened as Miss Henson, could change. Janelle sat with her friends at lunch, listening to their reactions. Ethan, who had been one of her most steadfast supporters, looked thoughtful. "Do you think Ms. Henson can actually change?" he asked, glancing at Janelle. Janelle considered his question. "I think it's possible. Change isn't easy, especially for someone who's set in their ways. But maybe this experience opened her eyes. If she's willing to put in the effort, then maybe she deserves a chance." Her friends nodded, their faces contemplative. Janelle knew that forgiving Miss Henson would be a challenge, but she also felt that holding on to resentment would only weigh her down. The real victory was in creating a better environment, one where students felt they could be themselves without fear. The first day back, when Ms. Henson returned to the classroom, the atmosphere was tense. She entered with a different demeanor, her once imposing stride replaced by a quieter, more measured approach. She avoided eye contact with the students as she set her papers down and looked out over the class, her gaze lingering on the familiar faces that had once seen her as an unbreakable authority figure. After a moment of silence, Ms. Henson cleared her throat and began, her voice softer than usual. "I want to acknowledge the challenges we faced together," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I understand that some of you may feel I haven't been fair or respectful in my teaching, and I've been given the opportunity to reflect on that. I'll be working to improve and to make this classroom a place where everyone feels welcome to learn and grow." The students exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. Ms. Henson had never acknowledged her behavior before, and this small act felt like a first step in the right direction. Janelle raised her hand, and Ms. Henson's eyes flickered with hesitation before she nodded for her to speak. "Thank you, Ms. Henson," Janelle said, her voice steady. I think we all appreciate the opportunity to start fresh. We're here to learn from each other, and I think that's something we can all work on together." A murmur of agreement passed through the room, and Ms. Henson offered a small nod, her eyes softening slightly. It wasn't a grand apology or a total transformation, but it was a start. And in that moment, Janelle felt a cautious optimism. Perhaps, against all odds, Ms. Henson was willing to change. The new project. To foster unity and promote open dialogue, the administration introduced a new school-wide project called Voices of Lincoln. Each student would create a presentation on an issue they cared deeply about, and all presentations would be shared at a special event celebrating student voices. This project was a direct response to the events surrounding Ms. Henson and was meant to give students a platform for self-expression and personal growth. Janelle knew immediately what she wanted to do. She planned to present on the importance of diversity in literature and how different perspectives could enrich learning. Her goal was to emphasize how embracing diverse voices wasn't just necessary, but vital to understanding the world around them. As she prepared her project, Janelle poured her heart into it. She included her personal experiences, her favorite quotes from authors who explored themes of justice and equality, and examples of books that had helped her grow. She even reached out to classmates, inviting them to contribute quotes or insights on what literature meant to them, creating a collaborative presentation that reflected the values she held dear. On the day of the event, the auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents. There was an air of excitement, a sense that this project was more than just another assignment. When it was Janelle's turn to present, she felt a rush of nervousness, but also a sense of purpose. She took a deep breath and began, her voice clear and passionate. "Books aren't just stories," she started, her gaze steady as she looked out over the audience. "They're windows into other people's lives, experiences, and struggles. When we read diverse perspectives, we see the world in new ways, and we grow. That's why it's so important that every voice is heard, especially in classrooms like ours." As Janelle spoke, the audience listened intently. She shared her journey, describing how her love for literature had fueled her desire to stand up against prejudice. She spoke about the strength she found in authors who had challenged societal norms, and how her classmates had shown her that unity was possible, even in difficult times. The applause was thunderous when she finished, but the most meaningful reaction came afterward, as her classmates and even some teachers approached her to thank her for her bravery and insight. They expressed how her words had inspired them to look at things differently, and how they admired her resilience. Ms. Henson was in the audience, her face unreadable. But as Janelle glanced her way, she caught a glimpse of something. Maybe respect, maybe a hint of regret. Janelle wasn't sure, but she felt that, in some way, her message had reached the teacher who had once been her biggest obstacle. A new path forward. In the weeks following the event, Ms. Henson made an effort to engage more openly with her students. She began to invite students to share their thoughts on assignments and allowed more freedom in how they approached their projects. She still held her standards high, but the coldness was gone, replaced by a genuine interest in her students' perspectives. The transformation wasn't instant or perfect, but it was real, and her students noticed. For Janelle, the changes went beyond her relationship with Ms. Henson. She had become a figure of quiet leadership in the school, a role model who had proven that standing up for what was right could bring about real change. Other students began seeking her advice, whether it was about schoolwork or personal challenges, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility to continue advocating for fairness and inclusivity. One afternoon, the assistant principal, Ms. Ramirez, approached Janelle in the hallway. "I wanted to let you know that the administration is launching a new student advisory board," she said with a smile. "We'd love for you to be a part of it. You've shown remarkable leadership, Janelle, and we believe you could help us shape policies that make Lincoln High a better place for everyone." Janelle felt a wave of pride and gratitude. She knew that this was her chance to make a lasting impact on the school, to ensure that no student would feel the way she had felt in Ms. Henson's class. She accepted the offer with a smile, knowing that this was just the beginning of her journey. A final conversation. One day after school, Janelle found herself walking through the empty halls when she saw Miss Henson leaving her classroom. They locked eyes for a moment, and Janelle hesitated before walking over. "Miss Henson," she began, her voice calm. "I just wanted to say thank you for the changes you've made. I know it wasn't easy." Miss Henson looked at her, her expression conflicted. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "You taught me something important, Janelle," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "I thought I knew what it meant to be a good teacher, but I was wrong. Thank you for helping me see that." They stood in silence for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. For Janelle, it felt like closure, a final chapter in a story that had shaped her in ways she hadn't expected. As Janelle walked away, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced adversity, spoken her truth, and inspired change. And now, as she moved forward, she knew she was prepared for whatever came next, not only for herself, but for every student who would come after her. Lincoln High had become a better place, and Janelle's legacy would be felt long after she graduated, a reminder of the power of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable strength of a voice that refused to be silenced.